Hello and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading stories from a website called Liminal Earth, a place where people submit their first-hand paranormal encounters and pin them on a map so that you can see the location in which the event took place. There are some recent changes to the website's interface in functionality, and this is probably because late last year they apparently gained a lot of traffic to their website. Good for them. But while they used to use a Google Maps plugin to pin the story's locations, their increased site traffic, quote, ended up overloading the Google Maps API and caused them to hit a rate limit. So they were then put in a position to pay Google a bunch of money or find another solution. This is all something I found out via their Patreon. And it looks like they opted for the latter because the Google Maps feature has been replaced with a different map. And there have been some other changes to the website that I've noticed that make it a little harder to navigate, but that could be because they are in the process of making adjustments, which is understandable. Never fear though, Goblin's here to take you through the tales and virtually walk you through their locations. Tonight, we are going to focus on stories surrounding cryptids, odd, undefinable creatures lurking about the highways and byways of the world. Again, if you are watching the video, during the story I will show Google Maps Street View footage of the location of each story. And in between stories, we may elaborate or expand on topics that come up in these reports. If all of that sounds good to you, let's get started. Our first story that we're going to read took place in June of 2000 in Newcastle, Delaware, and it's called Scary Hairless Cryptid. So the story begins with this little disclaimer. I know the rules say that first-person reports are preferred, but this is a strange story that my son encountered while walking through this park one evening. This is what happened in his words. My friend and I were slightly buzzed when we left his house on a breezy summer evening, having spent the late afternoon hanging out in my friend's parents' basement, trolling our friends on Facebook, and drinking a few cans of beer he had stashed underneath the stairs. We decided to meet some friends at the mall. Neither one of us had any bus money, so we decided to walk the 3 miles to get to our destination. Wanting to shave off some time, we cut through a wooded trail situated along a major highway that led into a tree-covered park area. On the other side of the long, winding forested path was a large shopping center where the mall was based. If you passed by the trail during the day, you'd rarely see anyone walking or biking along it, so it seemed a bit ominous, but there was also a large pond inside the forested area that was rumored to have been a decent fishing spot, and that made it a bit more approachable to some. As we made our way over a small bridge and through a dimly lit tunnel, we talked and joked about things that most teens did, and we felt relatively safe walking through the semi-dark pathway. But about 10 minutes later, we came upon a second bridge that led to the edge of a large, semi-dark opening in the woods. Even though the area lacked proper lighting, I noticed a shape hunched over something in the distance. This part of the woods was lit only by the soft light of the full moon, which helped us navigate our way ahead. I stopped walking first, and then my friend came to a halt as well. From where I stood, I thought it was a man, possibly tending to his dog during a nightly walk, but the abrupt silence as we neared the end of the overpass brought on a strange sense of weirdness, like something inside my head was telling me not to get any closer. A couple more cautious steps forward, and we were able to see that the form hunched over wasn't really a person at all. It was bent over what appeared to be a young deer and was feasting hungrily, making deep groaning sounds. My friend grabbed me by the elbow, and I quickly turned to face him, noticing the shock on his face as he silently worded, "What the hell is that?" I turned my head back around slowly, my heart pounding loudly in my chest as I took another look at the gigantic, hairless giant about 30 feet from us. My friend stupidly moved in front of me to get a closer look, almost in awe of what he was seeing, and as he approached the end of the bridge, he clumsily stepped into a small pile of rocks, which made a loud, crunching noise that was hugely emphasized by the dead silence of the night. The beast then stood up and turned his head, staring in our direction, In the darkness, I estimated that he had to have been at least 8 feet tall, with long muscular arms, and seemed hairless. I can't even tell you what color he was, but he was huge. My friend's eyes widened, and he realized the monster was staring right at us. And before I could give the creature a chance to advance, I turned around and began to run as fast as I could. My heart was pounding as I ran the 2 miles it took to get back to the other side of the trail. In my terror, I almost forgot about my friend and finally forced myself to look back to see if he was behind me as I got closer to the entrance of the park. Seconds later, I heard the sound of tired, thumping feet emerging from the darkness. As my friend approached me, he demanded, "Why did you leave me like that, shithead?" I looked at him and said, "If you want to go back and find out what that thing was, you go ahead, but I'm going home." To this day, I have never gone back into those woods. That was 10 years ago, and I still don't know what I saw, and I remember having trouble sleeping for days after seeing that strange creature. After that, the witness's mother, who submitted the story, wrote this. Let me say that I have tried to look up stories online about cryptid stories in Delaware and can't find any. We have a lot of strange hauntings and even UFO sightings, but not cryptids that I can find. One interesting thing that I wanted to add. I'd never heard of Richard Shaver or his experiences until about a month ago when I was watching a YouTube video about Brenton Sawin's encounter with a strange being. He referred to Richard Shaver's lifelong experiences with similar strange beings. If you read Richard Shaver's stories about Darrows and Taros and their underground civilization, you will find that he mentions that there are entrances to the underground cave system that led to these civilizations, and one can be found in Delaware, as well as other places in the East Coast. He never gave up the area where that entrance is, but I find it very interesting. And then I thought about my son's experience and wondered if somehow they were connected. I don't know, but it's a thought. There's a lot to unpack in that last bit there. I don't know who these people are that she's referring to, so I'm going to have to look into those. But first, concerning the actual story, it was a good story, almost a little too good. What I mean by that is it read almost like a piece of fiction, like a creepypasta. The cryptid they saw did even sound like The Rake, one of the most well-known creepypasta stories. And then there were just little details like the full moon. Of course, it was a full moon. And the moment when they come upon the monster plays out very much like a scene in a movie. I don't know. Maybe I'm being a little too critical and they were just doing their best to present a good story. And it was a good story. Now let's try and unpack some of what their mother said after the fact. First, she said that they couldn't find any Delaware cryptids, so I just had to double check myself and see if I could find any, and yeah, I didn't really come up with too much either. There are various creatures of native folklore, such as the Pukwudgie, and 2 attempted cryptids that turned out to be hoaxes, a merman and a swamp monster. I did read through an interesting thread on the Delaware subreddit, where someone asked for cryptids and strange local creatures, and there were some interesting personal encounters there. One person actually describes a creature not too dissimilar to the one in the story. Kmart Before Dawn wrote, "Was on Route 24 driving home around 11 p.m., maybe midnight, last August. Pitch black aside from my headlights as I'm the only car on the road, and it's the backwater part of that route. I see movement and look to my right. There's a creature trotting, like a goddamn horse, on the side of the road. It has the same stature as when a human tries to run on all fours, but none of the awkwardness. Its skin is pale, almost white, with a long, bony tail and ridges along its spine. Its face was elongated, but not dog-like. Couldn't make out any more as I floored it until I was in sight of streetlights again." Now, this stretch of highway seems to be about 90 miles south of where the story took place, so it's probably not the same creature, unless there's more than one. Now, when it comes to these names she dropped, one person she mentioned was Brenton Sawin, who seems to be a YouTube content creator who makes videos on different types of paranormal encounters, although they haven't posted any new videos in 4 years. They have a pretty extensive library of videos, so I can't be certain which video she's referring to in this post on Liminal Earth, but I may venture a guess that it is this one, called Hollow Earth, My Encounter with a Darrow. This leads us to the second name she mentioned, Richard Shaver. I hadn't heard of this man, but searching his name led me right to a very extensive Wikipedia page. Apparently, he was a Pennsylvania man who gained notoriety after writing into Amazing Stories, a science fiction magazine, in 1943, claiming to have knowledge and lived experience involving a prehistoric subterranean race of human-like beings who had built cities within caverns that led deep into the earth. There were benevolent beings called Taros and evil, sadistic beings called Daros, who were said to kidnap surface-dwelling humans and torture them. And that is the extremely basic and watered-down version of his claims and ideas. While many perceived that Richard Shaver was suffering from mental illness, possibly paranoid schizophrenia, many other people believed his claims were valid, and have even made claims to have had their own experiences and encounters with this prehistoric subterranean race. Please feel free to look into it more yourself. It is very interesting. Just to bring it back to where we started, at the very end of that last story we read, the mother to the witness of this story mentioned that they had heard that Richard Shaver mentioned that one of the entrances to the subterranean cities, inhabited by Taros and Daros, was located somewhere in Delaware, and that perhaps this may have some connection to her son's experience. This story has really led us down quite the rabbit hole, and you've only caught a glimpse of it based on what I put in this video. I have been reading weird shit for hours now. And don't get me wrong, I love it. This is what I consider to be a night well spent. But for now, my brain is absolutely scrambled. Let's see where the next story takes us. This one took place in March of 1985 in Albion, Maine, and it's called Terror at Fowler's Bog. This happened to me when I was 15 years old, the spring before I left home for good. I grew up in Maine. For those of you who think a trip to the Cascades is getting back to nature, Maine is the forest primeval. There's a reason Stephen King includes all those deep, dark, haunted forests in his books. The town which became his model for Salem's Lot lay about 20 miles from my front door as the crow flies. The Pet Cemetery was disturbingly close by. Albion was the name of my hometown, founded in 1754. Its only claim to fame is the birthplace of Elijah Lovejoy. The inhabitants had long since forgotten the significance of the town's namesake, and had allowed the burg to fade into the kind of decaying, vapid decrepitude one expects from such tiny, isolated hamlets. It was part H.P. Lovecraft and part Salem's Lot, without the literary references and the artistic punch of either. There were more cows than people in Albion, its economy based almost entirely on milk production. Most people think New England has 4 seasons, but Maine actually has 2, winter and several weeks of very chilly weather. There's also a sub-season, known to most locals as mud. Once, during the first week of mud, some high school friends and I went off into the aforementioned forest primeval, engaged in our primary occupation, avoiding school. We left town by way of an old logging trail that ran behind the general store, H.L. Key & Son. If we don't have it, you don't need it. And cut across thawing farmland and thickets until we reached the edge of Fowler's Bog. This was a vast expanse of dense marshland, which stretched from Albion to the Unity town line 8 miles away. In the winter, when the bog was frozen, you could walk, ski, or snowmobile across its surface safely, but for the rest of the year it was as treacherous a piece of ground as you could wish. We skirted the edge of the bog for several miles, admiring the first signs of spring, or very chilly weather, in the forest around us. Finally, we reached our destination, an old, tumble-down hunting cabin along the edge of the bog, its boards weathered and gray in stark contrast to the emerging greenery of the woods. We remained there for several hours as the sun made its way quickly across the sky, talking, joking, and speculating on the quality of existence outside Albion and Maine. Dark came early at that time of year, and before too long the shadows were lengthening rapidly as the sun began to slide down behind the trees. Now, we'd literally grown up in those woods and knew them very well. Fowler's Bog and the surrounding forest held no secrets for us. More than once we'd navigated our way home well after dark, without so much as a stubbed toe. But not this time. Somehow our little group became separated. Maybe the others left us behind intentionally. Maybe we just weren't paying attention for once. I don't know. But it was nearly full dark when my friend Matt and I realized the others were not to be seen. We laughed about it, thinking they'd either gone ahead to lay an ambush and scare us as we made our way through the dark woods, or they'd taken a wrong turn somewhere up ahead and would no doubt catch us up later. So we continued to pace, talking and laughing, until Matt stopped and jerked his head up and asked, "What the hell is that?" I looked to where he pointed. I have seen bears, moose, wolves, porcupines, foxes, deer, raccoons, coyotes, and bobcats, all in their natural habitats. I have seen some weird things in those woods, things I cannot to this day adequately explain. This was one of them. I can still recall the unfamiliar feeling of abject terror. It was the first and only time in my life I've ever been utterly helpless with fear. It was quite big. It was very, very black, and it made the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life as it made its way through the underbrush not 20 feet away from where we stood. We didn't see it clearly, thanks to the darkness and intervening foliage. It crossed our path and went down into the bog, still making that noise. Then we heard a muffled splash. Later we agreed it must have plunged into the bog at a deep spot. I never told my parents, but Matt told his, and they called the local sheriff, who took us out there a couple days later. Matt's parents came with us. We found the place easily enough, and there was plenty of evidence of the thing's passage. A swath of crushed forest underbrush crossed from the tree line down to the bog. Had we wished to, we could have easily followed it back into the forest, but the sheriff said it was a trail left by a couple of big bears, and said we were lucky not to have been charged or even mauled. Matt's parents looked at the sheriff as though he'd just told them he was a space alien, and would we mind joining him on Mars for tea? Matt's father called the sheriff every conceivable kind of ass, pointing out what we all knew. No bear or anything else we'd ever seen made that trail. But the sheriff just stood there calmly and took the verbal abuse, and after Matt's father had finished, he quietly said the matter was closed, and asked us not to make too much of it. That was the very last time my friends and I ever went near Fowler's Bog. Well, not only does the person who submitted this story make these literary references to the place they grew up in, but they honestly are a pretty talented writer themselves. There's a difference between the first story we read and this one, and I'm really not trying to poke holes in the first story, but they both are written very intentionally well, but there's something about the second one that still comes through as genuine, even though it's written extremely elegantly. It's a very compelling narrative, but I still find that it reads as genuine, if that makes sense. Anyway, I love that story. I have never been to Maine, but I've always been fascinated, and a lot of that has to do with Stephen King. I mean, he does make it seem so enchantingly creepy. And yeah, New England itself, also because of H.P. Lovecraft, they've just built up this lore surrounding this part of the United States. And it's a very interesting part of the United States in itself. There are so many ghost stories and folklore in New England and this part of the United States, and not to mention the history of witchcraft and the persecution of witches. Not to mention it's incredibly beautiful. That fall foliage and those covered bridges and the ocean. I definitely want to go someday. But yeah, this author just painted a really, really charming and interesting portrait of their small town of Albion, Maine. And they say that they lived closely to the location that inspired Salem's Lot. And even the location of this story, Fowler's Bog. That just sounds like a place that would have a cryptid, right? Fowler's Bog. About the cryptid, they really didn't even get to see too many details about it. Just that it was really, really big, very dark, and made a horrible sound. Although they didn't really elaborate on what that sound was. But, you know, just like the author they mentioned, H.P. Lovecraft, there is some terror in vagueness. Sometimes not fully seeing a monster makes it scarier. So, all in all, I thought that was a very well-told story. Actually, if it wasn't so fleshed out and well told, I probably wouldn't have included it because, like I said, you don't really see whatever it is and not really much happens, but just a really well done story. Really appreciate that. For our next story, we are going to travel to Queensland, Australia. This story took place in July of 2009, and it's called Daintree Rainforest. When I lived back up in far north Queensland, I'd often spend time in Daintree, one of Queensland's rainforests, hiking and camping out in the dry season. The place itself has lots of strange, known creatures, such as cassowaries. However, it seems to have some unknown ones, too. One time, when I was out hiking and it was early evening, I began hearing howling or hooting sounds. I initially thought it might be feral dogs, although the sound didn't match. After it seemed to get closer for a while, I stopped to try to see what it was. A few minutes later, 2 small, hairy creatures, about 3 to 4 foot tall, crossed my path. They looked apish, but not right. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have stories of hairy creatures such as yowies, and I wonder if this is what I saw that evening. Not a lot of details to this story, unfortunately, just enough to intrigue. It's an absolutely beautiful location, and I'm sure it houses all manner of strange and wonderful creatures. The yowie that they mentioned is basically a Bigfoot, or big hairy man type figure in Aboriginal folklore. It's described as a tall, bipedal humanoid with long black or reddish fur and a flattish snout, with large feet that are sometimes turned backwards. The point of this is to confuse those who come across a yowie's footprints, thinking that their point of origin is actually their destination. They are said to stand between 5 and 12 feet, and while the witness in the story said that the creatures he saw were 3 to 4 feet tall, it could be that they were baby or juvenile yowies. Cassowaries, on the other hand, while they have been proven to exist, they are nearly as secretive and secluded as Sasquatch. Not too terribly much is known about these large birds, which stand between 5 and 6 feet tall, because not only are they very good at avoiding humans, despite their size, they are known to be quite dangerous, considered to be the world's most dangerous bird, leading people to generally leave them alone. They look like dinosaurs, and technically, they are the closest living ancestor. If they don't charge you down, they can kick you and do some serious damage with their dagger-like claw. Seriously, a modern-day velociraptor. The author of the story we read mentions hearing howling or hooting sounds that didn't quite resemble the cries of dogs. I thought it was interesting that the cassowary are known for making the lowest frequency bird call, which is almost imperceptible to humans due to our auditory processing abilities. Because cassowary are generally solitary and live in dense rainforest, their calls need to carry, and they produce a deep, booming vocalization. And the bony structure on top of their head, called a casque, may aid in amplifying these sounds. I'm not sure if that's what the witness heard, but I find it very interesting. Cassowaries are definitely one of those animals that seem like some sort of living mythical creature. Alright, let's read one last short story. This one took place in January of 2024, very recent at the time of this recording, in Argentina, and it's called Long-Necked Scream Cow. I ran away from home and was walking through the route approaching the Mission Saliasana when I heard a death scream that reminded me of a banshee. When I look around into the darkness of the night, illuminated by the few lights there were, I saw what appeared to be a cow-shaped being, but its head was floating. Then I realized its neck was really long, and it was approaching me. I ran away as fast as I could without looking back. I hid myself at a gas station after running away for minutes, and I stayed between trucks till the sun rose. Many years passed till a friend told me he saw a cow with a long neck on the other side of the town, without me telling him my experience, and it chased him too. So, I wasn't crazy after all. Like I said, a short one, but a strange one. I couldn't find any creatures that really resembled this, or any cow cryptids. The only thing it reminded me of was a story from an old video I did called Giant Snakes, Plat Eyes, and Phantom Fiddlers. And there's a story with a ghost creature type thing called a Plat Eye. This is part of Southern ghost lore. It's known as a haint. If you want to know more about that, definitely listen to that video. That's a really, really good story. It's one of my favorites. It's called Orange Eyes. Anyway, it has a similar kind of being in it, if I recall correctly. But other than that, I'm not really sure what this could have been. What I also found interesting about this story is the place where it happened. The area this story took place in is called Tierra del Fuego, which translates to Land of Fire, which is pretty cool in itself. It's an archipelago divided between Argentina and Chile, and there's much more to this place that is interesting than just its name, which was unfortunately given to the land by Ferdinand Magellan, who saw the bonfires of the native peoples, the Yagan, while Magellan mistakenly thought these fires were preparations for an attack on his armada should he attempt to come ashore. They actually are just the bonfires of the Yagan used to keep warm, because despite being called the Land of Fire, it's actually quite cold, surrounded by glaciers and snow-capped mountains, and being windswept by Arctic gusts. The southernmost tip is only about 600 or so miles north of Antarctica, so it makes sense that the capital city in the Tierra del Fuego province is called Ushuaia, which means bay towards the end, as in the end of the world. Sometimes the natural world holds just as much mystery and intrigue as supernatural, and Tierra del Fuego is definitely a place that encapsulates that. So how fortunate are we to have heard a story from someone who lives in this beautiful and unique area? And with that, we go from the end of the world to the end of our time together tonight. Well, I certainly had fun. Not only did we get to read some fun and interesting first-hand paranormal experiences, but we also got to discuss cassowaries, ancient underground sadomasochistic societies, and Argentinian archipelagos. Thank you so much for joining me and partaking in this exploration, but not that shitty type of exploration like Ferdinand Magellan did. The kind where nobody gets hurt and we look about and wonder at this strange world we inhabit. See you next time.